The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled away from everything the Holloways had ever known. Thomas gripped the reins too tight, his knuckles white. Catherine held her Bible against her chest like a shield. Behind them the city faded, not just a place but a life, a dream gone. Josie clutched her little brother's hand, both of them too quiet for children who should have been laughing. They were leaving home. But where were they going? Boston had been kind to them once. The print shop with its warm, inky smell. The little house with the blue door where Catherine grew roses. The church where Josie and Caleb had learned to sing hymns in clear, bright voices. But now the shop was gone, the house belonged to someone else, and the only thing left was a piece of paper, a deed to land far away in Montana. Land they had never seen. Land no one wanted. Thomas Holloway sat stiffly on the wagon bench, the morning air biting his cheeks. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he might see the shadow of the man he used to be, the man who believed hard work was enough. The man who hadn't failed. Beside him, Catherine turned a page in her Bible. She read softly, not to him, not to the children, but to herself, as if the words could steady her heart. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted. Thomas heard it anyway. He wanted to believe it. But right now, God felt very far away. In the back of the wagon, Josie and Caleb huddled under a thin blanket. Josie was 12, old enough to understand they weren't just going on a trip. Old enough to see the way her father's shoulders hunched, like he was carrying a weight too heavy to name. Caleb, only 8, pressed his face against her arm. "Will there be trees there?" he whispered. Josie didn't know. She squeezed his hand. "Maybe." The train station loomed ahead, noisy and crowded. People shoved past, rushing toward their own futures. The Holloways stood still, their few belongings stacked beside them. A trunk of clothes, Thomas's tools, Catherine's good skillet, the children's books. Not much to start a new life. Thomas lifted Caleb onto the train first, then helped Josie. Catherine paused on the steps, her foot hovering like she might turn and run back. But there was nothing to run back to. She took a deep breath and climbed aboard. The whistle blew. The train lurched forward. And just like that, Boston disappeared behind them. Josie watched out the window as the world rushed by, houses, then fields, then wide open land she couldn't imagine ever calling home. Caleb fell asleep against her. Across from them, her mother's lips moved in silent prayer. Her father stared at his hands, rough and ink-stained, now useless. None of them spoke. The train rolled west, toward a broken farm, toward a sky too big and a land too empty, toward a future they couldn't see. But somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, God was already there, waiting. The land was nothing like Thomas had imagined. He stood in front of the sagging farmhouse, the wind biting through his coat. The field stretched out around him, not golden and ripe, but dry and tangled with weeds. The barn leaned to one side like a tired old man, its roof half caved in. A single, stubborn fence post stood upright in the sea of broken wood. Catherine stepped down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the dust. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The disappointment hung thick in the air. Josie and Caleb huddled close, their eyes wide. This was supposed to be their new home. But it didn't look like a home. It looked like a place the world had forgotten. Thomas walked toward the house, his steps slow. The front door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. A table with one broken leg. A stove rusted shut. A single chair, its seat split down the middle. He sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. He had promised them a fresh start. But this was just another kind of failure. Catherine sat beside him, her hand resting on his back. "We'll fix it," she said softly. Thomas wanted to believe her. But the words stuck in his throat. Josie wandered toward the barn, her feet kicking up little clouds of dirt. Inside, the sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof, painting stripes on the dusty floor. Something caught her eye, a glint of metal in the hayloft. She climbed the rickety ladder, her heart pounding. There, beneath a pile of old straw, was a book. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellowed. She wiped the dust away. Hymns of hope and glory. She didn't know why, but she clutched it to her chest like a treasure. Caleb crouched near the well, poking a stick into the dry earth. A movement in the brush made him freeze. A deer stood watching him, its ears twitching. For a moment, boy and animal stared at each other. Then, with a flick of its tail, the deer vanished into the trees. Caleb ran back to the house, his cheeks flushed. "Pa, there's animals here." Thomas managed a tired smile. At least the land wasn't completely dead. That night, they ate a quiet supper by lantern light, hardtack and a few strips of dried meat. Catherine opened her Bible and read, her voice steady. Josie flipped through the hymnal, humming under her breath. Caleb yawned, his head drooping onto his father's shoulder. Thomas stared out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, people had made a life in this hard land. Could they do the same? He didn't know. But morning would come either way. The sun was high by the time they reached Brier Fork. Thomas had hoped for a bustling town, full of friendly faces and supplies they could trade for. Instead, they found a row of weathered buildings, some with boarded-up windows. A general store, its sign hanging crooked. A blacksmith shop, the forge cold. A church at the end of the street, its steeple leaning like a tired old man. A few people glanced at them as they passed, their eyes curious but wary. A woman pulled her child closer. A man spit into the dirt and turned away. Josie gripped Caleb's hand. "Why is everyone so quiet?" Catherine smoothed her skirt. "They don't know us yet." Thomas tied the mule to a post and stepped into the general store. A bell jingled overhead. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a gray mustache, looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" Thomas cleared his throat. "We're the Holloways. We've taken up the old Miller farm." The man's eyebrows rose. "That place." He shook his head. "Ain't nothing but trouble there. Well dried up years ago." Thomas's stomach tightened. "We'll manage." The man snorted. "Suit yourself." They bought what little they could afford: flour, salt, a few nails. As they turned to leave, the shopkeeper called after them, "If you're staying, best talk to Reverend Boone. Only one around here who's got any hope left." The church was smaller up close, its white paint peeling. Thomas knocked lightly. The door creaked open and an old man peered out. His hair was white, his back slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "Well," he said, smiling. "New faces." "You're Reverend Boone?" Catherine asked. "That I am." He stepped aside. "Come in. You look like you could use a sit-down." Inside, the church was simple but clean. Sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting up the dust in the air. A single pew, a plain pulpit, a cross hanging on the wall. Reverend Boone handed Catherine a basket, flour, a jar of preserves, a few wrinkled apples. "Not much, but it's yours." Thomas hesitated. "We can't take your food." The Reverend waved a hand. "Nobody makes it alone out here. That's what the good Lord taught us." Catherine's eyes shone. "Thank you." Josie wandered to the front of the church, where a dusty piano sat in the corner. She touched the keys lightly. A sour note rang out. Reverend Boone chuckled. "Needs tuning. Just like the rest of us." Caleb tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Pa, can we come back here?" Thomas looked around the little church. It wasn't much, but it was solid. "Well, maybe, just maybe, a place to start." He nodded. "Yeah, son. We'll come back." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. The town might be fading. The farm might be broken. But for the first time since they'd left Boston, Thomas felt something flicker inside him. Something like hope. The sun dipped low over the prairie as Catherine set the table with the few dishes they had left. The cracked plates, the dented tin cups, the single spoon they passed between them, none of it matched, but she arranged them carefully anyway. Thomas watched her from the doorway, his arms crossed. "We could just eat from the pot," he said. Catherine didn't look up. "We'll eat properly. Like a family." Josie swept the dirt floor with an old broom while Caleb tried to help by picking up pebbles one by one. The house still smelled of dust and neglect, but the golden light from their single lantern made it feel almost warm. When the food was ready, thin porridge with a few wild onions Catherine had found near the creek, they sat together at the wobbly table. Thomas hesitated before reaching for his wife's hand. Josie grabbed Caleb's sticky fingers. Catherine bowed her head. Lord, we thank you for this food, for bringing us safely here, and for the promise of tomorrow. Amen. Amen, Josie whispered. Caleb echoed her, swinging his legs under the table. The porridge was bland, but no one complained. Between bites, Josie opened the hymnal she'd found. Can we sing after supper? Thomas nearly said no. His throat felt too tight for singing. But Catherine smiled. Of course we can. Caleb perked up. I know one. Jesus loves me. Josie flipped through the pages. It's in here. She pointed to the faded notes. When the last spoon scraped the bowls clean, Josie carried the hymnal to the lantern light. Her voice started soft, then grew stronger as Caleb joined in, happily off-key. Catherine's alto wrapped around their notes like a warm blanket. Thomas sat very still. The song his mother had sung to him as a boy filled the broken-down house, bouncing off the bare walls. Without meaning to, his lips began moving with the words he thought he'd forgotten. Jesus loves me, this I know. Outside, the wind rustled the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. But inside, for the first time since they'd come west, the Holloway house didn't feel empty. Thomas woke before dawn, his muscles aching from yesterday's work. He pulled on his boots quietly, trying not to wake Caleb, who slept curled on their makeshift bed. Outside, the morning air bit his cheeks. He walked to the pile of tools they'd brought: hammer, saw, a few precious nails. The fence line stretched before him, most posts rotted or knocked down. He set his jaw and got to work. By the time the sun burned off the morning chill, Thomas's hands were raw. He'd managed to set 3 new posts in the rocky soil. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Caleb came running out, his shirt half-tucked. Can I help, Pa? Thomas wiped sweat from his brow. Fetch me those smaller logs, son. Caleb dragged the wood over, his small arms straining. When he dropped the first one, it landed on Thomas's foot. Oof, watch what you're doing. Thomas snapped before he could stop himself. Caleb's face crumpled. He turned and ran toward the creek, his shoulders hunched. Thomas sighed, rubbing his sore foot. He should call the boy back. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he drove another nail harder than necessary. At the creek, Caleb kicked at the water, sending pebbles splashing. He picked up sticks, breaking them angrily. Then he saw it, a patch of soft earth near the bank. He knelt and began poking sticks into the ground, arranging them carefully. When Catherine found him hours later, he built a small cross from twigs tied with grass. What's this, sweetheart? She asked, kneeling beside him. Caleb sniffed. For the deer. In case it, you know. His chin wobbled. Like we did for Grandpa's dog. Catherine pulled him close. That's very kind. She studied his face. Did something happen? Caleb shrugged, but his eyes were wet. Pa's mad at me. Catherine stood, taking his hand. Let's go talk to him. Back at the fence, Thomas was hammering another post when he saw them coming. Caleb hid behind Catherine's skirts. Thomas set down his tools. His hands were shaking. Caleb, the boy peeked out. I'm sorry I dropped the log. Thomas knelt, ignoring the pain in his knees. No, son. I'm sorry I spoke harshly. He opened his arms. Caleb hesitated, then barreled into his father's chest. Thomas held him tight, breathing in the little boy's smell of dirt and sunshine. Over Caleb's head, he met Catherine's eyes. She smiled softly. That evening, they ate supper outside, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. Josie read aloud from the hymnal while Caleb leaned against Thomas, his eyelids drooping. 3 fence posts stood straight in the fading light. Not much, but enough. The morning sun streamed through the cracks in the farmhouse walls as Catherine brushed Josie's hair, working carefully through the tangles. Do we have to go? Josie asked, wincing as the brush caught a knot. Catherine smoothed the strands with her fingers. It's important. Thomas stood by the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His good shirt, the one without holes, itched at his neck. We don't know these people, he muttered. Catherine pinned her hair up, her mouth set in that quiet way that meant her mind was made up. We won't know them unless we go. The walk to town felt longer than usual. Caleb skipped ahead, chasing grasshoppers, while Josie clutched the hymnal to her chest like armor. The church bell rang faintly in the distance, its sound thin and lonely across the prairie. When they reached the little white church, only 5 people sat inside. Reverend Boone beamed from the pulpit as if the building were full. "Welcome, friends." Thomas guided his family to a pew near the back. The wooden bench creaked under their weight. An elderly woman with snow-white hair turned and smiled at Josie. A man with a thick mustache nodded to Thomas. The service was simple: a prayer, a scripture reading, a short sermon about faith being the substance of things hoped for. Thomas fidgeted, his mind wandering to the fence that still needed mending, the well that barely gave water. Then Reverend Boone said, "We'll close with a hymn. Does anyone have a request?" Silence filled the church. Josie's fingers tightened around the hymnal. Catherine nudged her gently. Josie stood, her knees shaking. We found this." She held up the book. "Could we sing Amazing Grace?" Reverend Boone's eyes lit up. "A fine choice. Do you play, child?" Josie's face went pink. "A little." The old piano in the corner was out of tune, its keys yellowed with age. Josie sat carefully on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes came out wobbly, but she kept going. By the second verse, Martha's clear soprano joined in. Then the mustached man's deep bass. Caleb, who didn't know the words, hummed along loudly. Thomas stared at his hands. The words rose in his throat like a forgotten dream. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. After the service, Martha pressed a jar of preserves into Catherine's hands. "Come to supper next Sunday," she said. "I'll make my chicken pie." Walking home, the prairie seemed less empty. Josie chattered about the piano, Caleb swung the empty jar by its string, and even Thomas walked with his shoulders a little straighter. Catherine slipped her hand into his. "See," she said softly. "We're not alone here." The abandoned schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, its windows boarded up, its bell tower silent. Catherine wiped dust from a pane of glass and peered inside. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked, shifting the toolbox in his hands. Catherine's reflection in the dirty glass was determined. The children need a teacher. Josie tugged at a weed growing through the steps. "Will I have to come too? Even though I'm big?" Catherine smiled. "You can help me teach." Inside, the schoolroom smelled of mildew and old paper. Desks sat in crooked rows, their surfaces carved with initials of students long grown. A layer of dust covered everything. Caleb sneezed. "It's dirty." Thomas set down his toolbox. "We'll fix it." For days they worked. Thomas patched the roof and repaired desks. Josie and Caleb scrubbed floors until their hands were raw. Catherine sorted through moldy readers, salvaging what she could. One afternoon, Reverend Boone arrived with a bucket of whitewash. "Heard about your project," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Soon others came. Martha brought a rag rug. The mustached man, Mr. Grady, they learned, fixed the broken stove. Even the skeptical shopkeeper donated a box of chalk. Josie explored the bell tower, her footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The bell hung thick with dust and cobwebs. She reached out and touched the cold metal. "Think it still works?" Reverend Boone asked from behind her, making her jump. Together they cleaned the bell, polishing it until it shone. "Should we ring it?" Josie asked. Reverend Boone winked. "Wait for the first day of school." The night before school was to start, Catherine fretted over her lesson plans by lantern light. "What if no one comes?" she asked Thomas. He squeezed her hand. "They'll come." At dawn, Josie stood in the bell tower, her heart pounding. Below, children gathered in the schoolyard, some clean and tidy, others barefoot and wary. Mothers lingered at the gate. Taking a deep breath, Josie grabbed the rope and pulled. The bell's clear voice rang out across the prairie, so loud and joyful it startled birds into flight. Downstairs, Caleb threw open the door as children streamed inside. Catherine stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped to keep them from shaking. "Good morning, class," she began. Thomas watched from the doorway. His wife's voice was steady, her eyes bright. The children quieted, their faces turned up like flowers to the sun. Outside, the bell's echo faded into the morning air, but its message lingered, a call to gather, to learn, to hope. The school in Brier Fork was open again. The day began like any other. Thomas up before dawn to check the fences, Catherine kneading dough for bread, Josie helping Caleb with his buttons. The morning sun painted the prairie gold as Thomas walked back to the house, his boots damp with dew. Then he saw it. An envelope lay on their rickety porch table, weighted down by a stone. His name stared up at him in familiar, sharp handwriting. Thomas's hands shook as he picked it up. He hadn't seen that handwriting in 5 years. Not since the fight. Not since his brother had called him a fool for mortgaging the print shop. Thomas? Catherine stood in the doorway, wiping floury hands on her apron. What is it? He turned the envelope over. From Daniel. The children gathered close as Thomas carefully broke the seal. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. He read silently, his throat tightening with each word. Dear brother, I hope this letter finds you. I heard from Mrs. Wilkins that you'd gone west. I've tried to write a dozen times but never knew where to send it. I was wrong to speak as I did. The debt wasn't your fault. The fire could have happened to anyone. I let my temper rule me, and for that I'm sorry. Enclosed is what I can spare. It's not much, but I hope it helps. Write to me, Thomas. Let me know you're well. Your brother, Daniel. A folded banknote fluttered to the floor. Caleb scooped it up. Look, Pa. Money. Thomas sank onto the porch step, the letter crumpling in his grip. All the anger, the shame, the lonely years, they rose up like a storm in his chest. Catherine sat beside him, her hand warm on his back. He misses you. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas lit a lantern and took out paper and ink. 3 times he started the letter. 3 times he crumpled the page. Finally he wrote, Dear Daniel, we're on a farm in Montana now. The land is hard but good. Josie is tall as a sunflower. Caleb talks more than both of us combined. Thank you for the money. I'll use it to fix the barn roof before winter. I was proud. I should have written sooner. Your brother, Thomas. He sealed it quickly before he could change his mind. Outside, the stars shone bright and cold. Somewhere back east, his brother would wake to a world that felt a little different. A world where the silence between them was broken. The first snow came early, blanketing the prairie in white. At first, the children rejoiced, building snowmen, catching flakes on their tongues. But as the days grew shorter and the cold dug its teeth in, the joy faded. Thomas checked the supplies for the 100th time. The flour sack was nearly empty. The smoked meat was down to a few tough strips. The potatoes they'd harvested were small and few. We'll be all right, Catherine said, stirring a thin soup of wild onions and the last handful of barley. The Lord will provide. Thomas didn't answer. He'd seen winters like this before. The Lord helped those who helped themselves. The next morning he set out for town through knee-deep snow. The wind howled, biting his face. He needed medicine. Caleb had woken feverish, his cheeks flushed red. Brier Fork was eerily quiet. The general store was nearly bare. Got some willow bark, the shopkeeper said, pulling a small pouch from under the counter. That's all I can spare. Thomas counted out his coins. Any word on when the supply train might come? The man shook his head. Not till spring, most like. The walk home was worse. The wind had picked up, swirling snow into blinding clouds. Thomas stumbled, the medicine clutched tight in his pocket. His toes had gone numb in his boots. Just get home, he prayed. Let me get home to them. Darkness was falling when he finally saw the glow of their cabin window. His legs burned with effort as he pushed through the last stretch of snow. Inside, Caleb lay curled under every blanket they owned, his breathing quick and shallow. Catherine pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. Got it? Thomas gasped, handing her the pouch. His fingers were so stiff he could barely move them. Catherine brewed the willow bark into tea, coaxing Caleb to sip it. The cabin smelled bitter and earthy. Josie hovered nearby, her face pinched with worry. That night, Thomas sat by Caleb's bed, listening to the wind rattle the walls. The fire was low, they had to save the wood. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. A knock at the door made them all jump. Martha stood on the porch, her shawl dusted with snow. In her hands was a steaming pot. Bone broth, she said, thrusting it at Catherine. From my last chicken. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. We can't take your... Hush, Martha said. That boy needs it more than I do. The rich, salty smell filled the cabin as Catherine ladled out the broth. Caleb managed a few sips before drifting to sleep, his forehead already cooler. Thomas stared into the fire long after Martha had gone. The storm still raged outside, but the knot in his chest had loosened. They weren't alone. And for now that was enough. The blizzard howled around the barn like a living thing. Thomas fought to close the heavy door against the wind, his muscles straining. Inside, their lone milk cow, Bess, paced restlessly in her stall, her sides heaving. She's early, Thomas shouted over the storm to Josie, who stood clutching a lantern. The flickering light cast wild shadows on the walls. The calf wasn't due for weeks. Josie's eyes were wide. What do we do? Thomas grabbed an armful of clean straw. We keep them alive. Bess moaned, a deep, guttural sound Thomas had never heard before. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her trembling flank. Easy, girl, he murmured. Easy now. The storm raged outside, snow finding every crack in the old barn walls. Josie held the lantern steady while Thomas helped guide the calf into the world. When the small, wet body finally slid onto the straw, it didn't move. Thomas rubbed the tiny creature with handfuls of straw. Come on, he whispered fiercely. Breathe. Josie knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she helped wipe the calf's nose. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then a twitch. A shudder. A weak cough. The calf drew its first breath. Thomas sat back on his heels, his own breath coming fast. Bess immediately began licking her baby, her rough tongue stimulating the tiny body to life. Josie's face glowed in the lantern light. She's so small. The calf, a heifer, was indeed small, her legs wobbling as she tried to stand. Her coat was the color of fresh cream, with one brown spot over her left eye like a patch. Josie touched the spot gently. Promise, she said. We should call her Promise. Thomas put an arm around his daughter's shoulders. Outside, the wind still screamed, but here in the barn, with the cow's quiet grunts and the calves' shaky breaths, the world felt peaceful. As they left the barn hours later, the storm had eased. Dawn painted the snow pink. Reverend Boone's words came back to Thomas. Sometimes God sends miracles in small, stubborn packages. He looked down at Josie, her face tired but happy. Maybe the Reverend was right. The chapel bell hadn't rung in years, not properly, not with people coming to hear it. But today the whole town gathered as Josie climbed the ladder to the bell tower, her hands careful on the old ropes. Below, the people of Brier Fork stood in the churchyard. Martha with her famous chicken pie, Mr. Grady with his fiddle, even the shopkeeper, his arms crossed but his feet planted firmly in the dirt. Catherine stood beside Reverend Boone, her hands clasped tight. The children she taught, now clean-faced and bright-eyed, fidgeted with excitement. Caleb held Thomas's hand, bouncing on his toes. Ready? Reverend Boone called up to Josie. She took a deep breath and pulled. The bell's deep voice rang out across the prairie, so loud and clear it seemed to shake the very ground. Birds burst from the trees in a flurry of wings. The sound rolled over the fields, over the newly planted crops, over the Holloway farm where Promise the calf lifted her head from grazing. People cheered. Mr. Grady struck up a tune. The children began to sing, one of the hymns Josie had taught them from the old book. Thomas stood very still, letting the music wash over him. He remembered the broken man who had first come to this land, the man who thought God had forgotten him. Catherine slipped her hand into his. Look what we've built, she whispered. Thomas looked around at the laughing faces, at the church they'd restored together, at his children singing with full hearts. The land was still hard. Life would always have its struggles. But they weren't alone anymore. As the last notes of the hymn faded, Reverend Boone raised his hands. This, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, is what happens when we choose hope. Josie came down from the bell tower, her cheeks pink. Caleb ran to hug her. Thomas put his arms around his family, holding them close as the sun warmed their faces. The bell's echo still hummed in the air, a sound that said, "We are here. We endure. We believe." The morning dawned crisp and clear, with a golden light that seemed to pour like honey over the Holloway farm. Thomas stood at the edge of their wheat field just as the first rays of sun peeked over the distant mountains, his breath making small clouds in the cool air. He reached out and ran his fingers through the stalks, feeling the weight of the grain. It was heavy with promise, their first real harvest since coming west. Behind him, the farm had transformed. The house stood proud with fresh whitewash gleaming in the morning light, blue curtains fluttering in the kitchen window. The barn, once sagging and broken, now stood straight and strong, its doors wide open to reveal promise, their miracle calf now grown sturdy, contentedly chewing her cud beside Bess. The well gave clear, cold water without complaint. Fences ran straight and true across the land. A screen door slapped shut and Catherine stepped onto the porch, her apron already dusted with flour. "They'll start arriving soon," she called, shading her eyes against the sun. "Josie's finishing the pies and Caleb's gathering the last of the strawberries from the patch." Thomas turned and smiled at his wife. The worry lines that had etched her face when they first arrived had softened. Her hands, once raw from hard work, now moved with confident grace as she wiped them on her apron. The Bible she kept on the kitchen windowsill was well worn, its pages softened from daily use. Inside, the house buzzed with activity. Josie, now 13 and nearly as tall as her mother, carefully pulled a golden-crusted apple pie from the oven, the sweet smell mixing with the savory aromas of roasting meats and fresh bread. Caleb, his 9-year-old hands surprisingly deft, arranged wild strawberries in a bowl, sneaking one into his mouth when he thought no one was looking. "Pa says we've got near 40 people coming," Josie said, brushing a flour-smudged cheek with the back of her hand. "Do you think the table will hold all the food?" Catherine laughed, the sound warm and bright. "We'll make it hold. This harvest belongs to everyone who helped us." She glanced out the window where the long trestle tables stood under the old oak tree, already set with their best dishes and wildflower bouquets in mason jars. As the sun climbed higher, wagons began arriving from town. Martha came first, her arms laden with jars of preserves and her famous chicken pot pies. Mr. Grady brought smoked venison and his fiddle. The shopkeeper arrived with his wife and children, carrying jars of honey from his hives. Reverend Boone came last, his worn Bible under one arm and a basket of fresh-baked bread under the other. Thomas greeted each one, his handshake firm, his eyes bright. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were family. The people who had helped mend fences and rebuild the barn. The women who had taught Catherine how to preserve food for winter. The children Josie had befriended and Caleb had played with. The congregation that had welcomed them when they had nothing to offer but their need. The feast was laid out under the oak tree, a bounty that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Platters of roasted meats, bowls of vegetables from garden patches, fresh-baked breads and pies of every description. The children ran laughing through the fields while the women admired the garden and the men examined the healthy crops. When everyone had eaten their fill, Reverend Boone stood and raised his hands for quiet. The chatter died down as all turned to face him. Even the wind seemed to still in the branches of the old oak. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "this farm was a place of broken dreams. The fields lay fallow, the buildings sagged with neglect, and the people who came here carried hearts heavy with doubt." His eyes found Thomas's. "But look what faith and fellowship have built. Look what happens when we trust in God's plan and help one another through the trials." Thomas felt Catherine's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and sure. He remembered that first terrible night when they'd huddled in the broken-down house, listening to the wind howl through the cracks, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Now, as he looked around at the smiling faces, the sturdy buildings, the fields heavy with grain, his throat tightened with emotion. Josie stood suddenly, her treasured hymnal in hand. "Can we sing? All together?" Without waiting for an answer, she opened the book and began. One by one, voices joined in, old and young, rich and poor. The melody rose into the twilight, wrapping around them like a prayer. "Great is thy faithfulness, morning by morning new mercies I see." Thomas bowed his head as the words washed over him. The journey hadn't been easy, the back-breaking work, the bitter winter, the moments of doubt and despair. But through it all, grace had sustained them. The kindness of neighbors had strengthened them. Their faith, though sometimes as small as a mustard seed, had carried them through. As the last notes faded into the gathering dusk, Caleb tugged at his sleeve. "Pa?" he asked, his face serious in the lantern light. "Is this home now? Really home?" Thomas lifted his son onto his shoulders, looking out over their farm, their friends, their future. The lanterns twinkled like stars against the darkening sky. Mr. Grady's fiddle began a lively tune, and laughter rose as couples began to dance in the grass. "Yes, son," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is home." The stars blinked awake overhead as the celebration continued late into the night. They had come west with nothing but a deed to broken land and hearts full of doubt. But God and this hard, beautiful country had given them so much more. A family, a purpose, a community, a harvest of hope that would carry them through whatever seasons lay ahead. Did this story of faith and perseverance touch your heart? If you enjoyed following the Holloway family's journey from despair to hope, please like and share this story with others who might need its message of hope. Subscribe for more inspiring tales of faith, courage, and new beginnings. Every like and subscription helps us create more uplifting content to brighten your day. What was your favorite moment in the Holloway story? Which character did you relate to most? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from our readers.